Hi, I'm Taylor Owen. From the Globe and Mail, this is Machines Like Us. A couple of years ago, OpenAI lost two of its most prominent people. Co-founder Ilya Sutskever and Chief Technology Officer Mira Murati. Within a few months, both had started new companies and secured $2 billion apiece in seed money, some of the largest initial investments in Silicon Valley history. The crazy part? Neither of them had developed a product yet, or even had a prototype for one. Now, Sutskever's company is valued at $32 billion, and Murati is in talks to have her company valued at $50 billion, which would make it worth more than giant corporations like Ford and Target. Neither Sutskever nor Murati's companies are making money yet, and it's not at all obvious that they ever will. Investors who met with Murati said she wouldn't give them any information on what she was working on, or how she even planned to turn a profit. So the venture capitalists dumping billions of dollars into these companies aren't investing in a sound business plan. They're investing in an idea that eventually AI will transform the world. But skeptics saw these wild valuations as something else. Clear, unambiguous proof that the AI industry looks a lot like a bubble. Over the last couple of years, massive investment in AI has largely kept the economy afloat. The so-called Magnificent Seven, tech companies like NVIDIA, Meta, and Microsoft, now account for more than a third of the value of the S&P 500. To put that a little more bluntly, if AI is a bubble and it pops, then the whole economy might go down with it. And if that happens, Gary Marcus will probably say, "I told you so." Marcus is a professor emeritus at NYU, a best-selling author and the founder of two AI companies, one of which was acquired by Uber. For more than 20 years, he's been saying that we're going about AI all wrong, that the LLMs that we're all using just aren't that good, and that the level of money being thrown at them is completely detached from reality. These arguments have made him something of a pariah in the world of AI. He's earned the ire of people like Jan LeCun and Sam Altman. Recently, though, more and more AI experts are conceding that Gary might have been right all along. And if that's the case, if AI is a bubble and it's about to pop, what does that mean for the rest of us? Gary, welcome to Machines Like Us.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for that lovely introduction.
Let's get into it. First off, how do you define a bubble, and how do we know if we're in one?
Well, I guess there's different notions one could have here. So one is, you could say LLMs are going to disappear from the face of the planet. They're just entirely a fad. And AI has seen fads where things disappear, at least largely. Like there's something called a support vector machine was all the rage in the early 2000s. Nobody ever talks about them anymore.
What did that do? I don't know about that.
It was a way of doing classification. And ultimately, LLMs are another way of doing classification. And Google made heavy use of them. Google's AI program was largely built around them for a while. Nobody talks about them anymore. So one sense is like, are LLMs a fad? And another is about the financial valuations. Like, how much money are these companies going to make? My view is that LLMs are here to stay, but they're not AGI, artificial general intelligence. A lot of people were treating them as if they might be. I was just looking at a schwack of headlines where people predicted in 2025 we would see AGI driven by LLMs, machines that could do anything a person could do. It's pretty clear as we record this that the end of 2025 is going to come and we will have not reached AGI. There's a way in which the expectations were built very high, and the valuations are basically built around those expectations. So artificial general intelligence, when it comes, and I do think it will come, will be worth trillions of dollars. But the fatal error here was assuming that LLMs, large language models like ChatGPT, would bring us to AGI. But the reality that I've been pointing out for years is that they're not reliable enough. They hallucinate. They have reasoning errors. They have planning errors. And the point is, if you can't solve those problems, you're not going to replace all of knowledge work. What you're going to get is what we have now, which is people do lots of proofs of concept with these things in their businesses, and most of them don't have a good return on investment. Everybody, I think, in the field now knows this study by MIT that showed 95% of the companies don't return on investment. Why don't they return on investment? Because the technology is not reliable enough. You have to build a whole lot of tooling and machinery around it to actually get it to work right. It's all kind of an approximation to intelligence. I think of the 80-20 rule. There's a kind of 80-20 for AI, which is, or for large language models anyway, which is that large language models can approximate anything to 80%, but 20% of the time it's going to make wild errors. You just can't trust it to do it. And a lot of businesses have discovered that. So to kind of wrap up my first answer, what's making this a bubble is that the valuations for the companies are predicated on the companies making money, having invested trillions. And there probably aren't going to be trillions of dollars of revenue in a technology that is inherently unreliable. There might be trillions of dollars of return for some future technology that probably works on different principles. We will someday invent better approaches to AI that really will be kind of deserving of the hype that we're giving to the current ones. But the current ones don't deserve the hype. The valuations are premised on them reaching artificial general intelligence. It's becoming increasingly clear that they won't. And then there's a bunch of other problems we could get into. But the bottom line is, they're probably going to lose money. NVIDIA is going to make money, right? Because people buy their chips. They're selling shovels in the gold rush. But why do we have that phrase? Because the gold rush didn't have that much gold, right? And so it was the shovel sellers who made the money. So NVIDIA is making the money, but other companies have problems. Everybody's basically building the same thing. So part of the problem is we have a commodity and hence a price war. Everybody's building LLMs. They're not building 10 different technologies. So you have all these companies basically doing the same thing, investing in the same experiment, because it's all a kind of scientific experiment. Can we get AGI out of building larger and larger models? That is the scaling hypothesis. And we keep getting the same result, which is you get models like GPT-5 that are in fact disappointing, that don't meet expectations. Grok 4 didn't meet expectations. Claude 4 didn't meet expectations. Gemini 3 is a little better, but it's not that much better. And people thought that might be AGI. That's not AGI either. So we run the same experiment over and again. Everybody has the same model. That forces price cuts. So LLMs will stay around. They will continue. Large language models will continue to exist. They'll be dirt cheap. Some people will find uses for them, but the revenue is not going to be there. And if one company came up with a real differentiator where their system actually was reliable, yeah, that would be worth a lot of money. But LLMs, I don't think they have that in them.
Is part of the question there, how good is good enough to make the returns on investment that we currently see?
Absolutely.
And is AGI really the only benchmark? Like, could these LLMs get good enough to see return on investment? So another MIT study I saw recently speculated that AI could replace 11% of work, current models.
I'm skeptical of the 11%. We could come back to that separately, but let's...
Sure, but even let's just say it's like 5%, right? Like some percentage of replacing global labor could, in theory, without AGI, lead to a strong enough return on investment to not have a bubble pop, for example.
I fully
right?
take your point. I think it's the right question to ask from an economic perspective, right? What is good enough? What can you take over? A lot of what we have seen is that these kinds of things can do tasks, but not whole jobs. So I think a touch point should be a famous declaration that Jeff Hinton, now Nobel Prize winner, made in 2016. He said, we might as well stop training radiologists. It's just completely obvious that deep learning is going to replace them. And what's actually happened is deep learning has made some aspects of radiology better, but it doesn't have the breadth and sophistication that a real radiologist has. And so it hasn't replaced any radiologists. There are like 500 startups and hundreds of patents and so forth. There's a very active scene trying to replace radiologists. But invariably what you find is it works in some laboratory setting, and then you take it out in the clinic and only works some of the time, and et cetera, et cetera. And so nobody nowadays really thinks you're going to replace the radiologist. What you typically find is that you can replace some of what people do, or really you speed up part of it, you change the nature of the job. This is like, construction workers now use, cranes or whatever. That doesn't mean you don't need the construction worker. It means maybe the construction worker can do more. Then you look at the reliability issue. So some of the things you want to replace, you can do well enough. Some of them, you replace them and you wind up with a mess. The other issue is, again, the economics of how much you can charge for it, right? Because everybody's building the same thing and there's no mode and so forth. The prices that the companies can charge, they've gone down by a factor of 100, somewhere between 100 and 1,000, like over the last 12 months. I don't know the exact numbers, but that's ballpark, right? So, if you're charging $1 last year and you can only charge a penny this year, and you can only use it for some of the tasks, but you can't actually replace the worker, like the economics don't really make sense. They actually make sense for the customer. So to the extent that you want to use an LLM, okay, not too many people have found return on investment, but at least the investment is going down because it gets cheaper to operate it. And so this is why my view is LLMs will stay. There are some use cases. Those use cases will get cheap. People will keep using them, right? Mm-hmm. But
the economic value just won't be there.
Yeah. I mean, like, how is Sutskever going to make back, what is the valuation, $32 billion?
Yeah.
And of course, if you know how the investment community works, they're not happy if they get, the money they put in. They want to get a return on that, right? And so what's going to happen there is he, like, they talk about 10xing their money, right? That's the common thing in venture capital. That's what investors seek. So are you telling me that his company is going to IPO at $320 billion? Like, maybe, but as you say, they don't have a product, they don't have any revenue, so like it's tough. And then another way to think about it is maybe there'll be a winner or two here, but they can't all win because there's not enough money on the planet to kind of justify these outlandish valuations. So
is that why people so you're starting, I was amazed to see Mark Zuckerberg and Sam Altman both musing about a possible bubble recently. And are they willing to do that because they're hoping they're going to be the winner in a bubble?
I mean, I think some of it is kind of inoculation. Like, I don't think Altman went into this thinking there was a bubble. I mean, he was talking about like 10xing the world's productivity and I forget, like doubling the GDP or something. I forget the exact numbers he had on GDP. And I think he was genuinely bullish on this. I mean, part of me thinks he's a bullshit artist. Maybe it was all made up. I don't really know. But certainly he was publicly very bullish about it. And now, if there's a bubble, he has a problem. So the best thing he can do, I mean, if there's a collapse of the bubble, he has a problem. The best thing that he can do is to kind of inoculate himself and say, see, I told you it might be a little overvalued, but we're still cool. So I think that's Altman's angle on it. Zuckerberg might have a different angle. He actually has money. Like Sam doesn't, right? There was a famous interview a couple of weeks ago where Brad Gerstner says,
how can a company with $13 billion in revenues make 1.4 trillion of spend commitments, and you've heard the criticism,
First
Sam.
Of all, we're doing well more revenue than that. Second of all, Brad, if you want to sell your shares, I'll find you a buyer.
Altman got huffy and didn't really answer the question. A lot of people took note, and that is, I think, part of what's driving the current drop in valuation, right? Zuckerberg can actually burn $30 billion. Right. He's done it before.
He has 100 plus billion a year in ad revenue.
So for him, maybe the move is to wait everybody out. Like if you're Zuckerberg and you want to win at AGI, and, for whatever reason, I think he does, you can lose $30 billion a year, no sweat for the rest of your life.
To stay in the game, right?
Just to stay in the game. And if it all contracts, that's fine. Then there's fewer competitors, better for you. So I think he's playing a different game. He's not as desperate for cash, right? If Sam has been doing this thing where he keeps doubling his valuation, roughly speaking, he went from 11 to whatever to 86 to 150, I think, to 300. Now there's like a private valuation of 500 for a tender that people are talking about, whatever. He has to keep doing that because if he doesn't, he runs out of money, right? So he's playing double or nothing every round. So you can play that game to a certain extent, but the problem is at some point he may lose, right? So next valuation, if this one's 500, needs to be at $1 trillion to make everybody happy. And like he's already gone to Massa, and I think he's already gone to Saudi Arabia. There's nobody else that can write, $1 trillion or checks on $1 trillion valuations, right?
For sure, right? I mean, now we're talking massive investment.
So the problem is Sam is burning tens of billions of dollars a year. I think the most recent estimate was $3 billion a month. He's burning billions and billions of dollars. And he doesn't have a lot of cash in the bank. He has some, but his whole hypothesis is we're going to get to AGI by scaling, by keep doubling or multiplying by 10 the size of the model. So he's increasing the amount of money he has to play. I mean, he's like a guy at the roulette wheel, doubling his bet every time. And that can work for a while, but usually in the end, it doesn't.
And if it doesn't for him and for OpenAI, I mean, that might not be the end of the world to Google and Meta, but it's not going to be good for the economy. What happens then? Like, what are the costs of that bubble bursting?
Nobody knows, and I will give you my metaphor, which is the blast radius. So the blast radius is like, how much collateral damage do we get? That's basically what you're asking. I'm just giving you a metaphor. But here's how to think about it, right? Is the minimal case is a bunch of companies like Andreessen and Sequoia that put a lot of money into OpenAI, lose their shirts. Some of them go out of business. Some of them are fine because they were doing well enough in the first place, right? So that's like the minimal case is these big investors, lose on these bets. If that's all that happens, not too many hearts are really going to bleed. They're going to be like, well, serves those guys right. But the next thing to think about is all of those guys get their money from pension funds, right? Or get a lot of their money from pension funds or sovereign wealth funds and so forth. So like California's pension plan, CalPERS, has money in OpenAI. I think at this point it's probably on the order of $1 billion. If California's pension fund loses $1 billion, that's not good, right? And it's also not good if there's a kind of contamination effect. If OpenAI, it doesn't even have to go out of business, but let's say it doesn't make its round, it has to kind of contract and reconfigure, the bloom is off the rose, people start to look at it like WeWork, which is something I've warned might happen. So, like it doesn't go out of business, but it gets crippled, right? Well, other things are going to happen too, right? Because people are going to look at NVIDIA, right? And they're going to be like, well, OpenAI has whatever it has at this point, a couple $100 billion in commitments to NVIDIA that are on NVIDIA's balance sheet, but they're probably not going to actually, make good on that. And wait, Oracle, same thing, et cetera, et cetera. And so all of those companies are going to start to go down. And so the next thing that might happen, and I'm not done here, is that the whole stock market might go down, right? Because you gave the numbers at the beginning. It's a very large fraction of the market right now, right? And so if, one day NVIDIA drops 20% and OpenAI is viewed as WeWork, Oracle takes another hit beyond where it is, like, these indexes go down, then a lot of people start running for the hills, right? Then it looks like a bank run. So the whole market goes down. That's not great. And then here's the thing that I really don't know about, and the one that actually worries me the most is I don't know how much the banks are into all of this, right? So the banks are probably financing people's bets on generative AI. And if all those people lose those bets on generative AI, then the banks take a hit. And then it starts to look like 2008, where you get a liquidity crisis. Then you have to have a government bailout. I mean, I'm already getting a lot of signs that there might be a government bailout. And at that point, then the taxpayers pay. So people take a hit on their retirements on this scenario. Taxes go up in order to cover the bailout. Interest rates go crazy. All kinds of, messy things happen. So that'd be sort of the broadest blast radius. So part of me is like, I want to be conservative. I have a good track record of being right on a lot of these things. I don't want to say it's all going to collapse, like some people have said. I think the conservative thing to say is it's probably going to be not good, and we don't know how not good it's going to be.
So let's get into what might make it a bubble and some of the arguments you've made for why we might be overvaluing this current generation of technology. And I've heard you say that there's a technical argument for a bubble and an economic one. I want to start with the technological one. Why just broadly is the hype we've placed in the current version of AI misplaced?
People kind of treat it like magic. Most people are not trained to think about artificial intelligence and what I would call kind of almost like counterfeit humans. They pretend as if they're human. They often talk in the first person. Sometimes they will say stuff that can't possibly be true. Like they'll tell you what schools their kids are going to, and they don't have kids and whatever. But they fool a lot of people. There's a whole phenomenon now of AI delusions, for example, where people get taken in by these machines and think they're having these amazing conversations that aren't really real. There have been suicides associated with it and so forth. So the ordinary person doesn't really know how to evaluate AI. You could think about it from an evolutionary psychology perspective, right? We're evolved for certain kinds of problems, like finding food, and avoiding predators. We did not evolve to distinguish a fake from a real reasoning being. We just didn't. And so
Because language was always from a being.
language is always from a being. The first evidence of this was before I was born, was in 1965 with Eliza, which was a famous AI system you probably heard of that masqueraded as a therapist. And it was dumb as a box of rocks. It was just matching keywords. If you say, girlfriend, it would ask you to say, well, tell me more about your relationship. It didn't actually understand what a relationship is. It just knew how to say that sentence. And people would sit there on teletypes, which is basically like text messaging, and pour out, their innermost things, just like they're doing now with ChatGPT. So we've known for 60 years that the human mind is vulnerable to overestimating the intelligence of fakers. We tend to see a few things that a human does, and we're just like, well, that's a human. And it's wrong. So this is a long way of telling you that people overestimate the technology. Now, what's wrong with the technology is it doesn't have a deep understanding of the world. It doesn't really have a model of how the world works. All it does is approximate basically, given the language that it's seen, what other language might be used right now. We need to have AI systems that represent the world. My best example of this, or simplest example of this, is chess. Large language models are trained on the game of chess. They see millions of games because they're free and in the internet, and they're trained on the whole internet. They also see things like the rules of chess in Wikipedia and chess.com. They see books like Bobby Fischer Teaches Chess, which is the book that I learned from, and so forth, right? And still, they will make illegal moves, which no human would ever do. And so they have not figured out how chess actually works. They don't have a model of what a board is, what the pieces can do, and et cetera, even given explicit information. This is an incredibly serious limitation for these systems. And it's why we get things like hallucinations, right? They don't have a model of who was born where, what did they do, et cetera. That model is there for the taking in that particular case out on Wikipedia, but they don't know how to integrate that information. So there's
Can you say more about that? I think this is a really important distinction. So what would it mean to have a model of those relationships?
So on chess, it would be having the moves. In, let's say, biographical information, minimally, like you should know where people are born if it's a public record. I wrote a whole essay about Harry Shearer, and I'll give him as an example. He's an actor whose voice you recognize because he does Mr. Burns on The Simpsons. So he's pretty well known. He was on Saturday Night Live for a couple of years, et cetera. So information about him is readily available, right? And in fact, on Wikipedia, it tells you that he was born in Los Angeles. And even if you didn't have access to Wikipedia, it's written in many other places because he's a fairly well-known actor. And so he's in IMDb and Rotten Tomatoes and et cetera, right? So this is easily attainable information. But one day I was about to have breakfast with him in Los Angeles. He sent me this funny thing. A friend who sent a ChatGPT, I think it was, biography of him claiming that he was a British actor, right? And he is not British. So how does the system come up with that? Well, one way to think about it is that the system takes all the information it has, breaks it up into little pieces, tries to find groups of bits of information that predict one another, and then reconstructs things. And so it winds up like with a cluster, as to use a technical term, a cluster of things like a bunch of different comedians. It doesn't track each one individually. A good world model tracks individuals and their properties independent of the kinds that they belong to, which is a point I made in my 2001 book, The Algebraic Mind, where I think was the first person to anticipate hallucinations. So this problem has been going on for a quarter century. It has not solved. And I don't know how many times I offered major figures in the field, said hallucinations will go away in the next few years. I offered to bet them. They never took the bets. And the hallucinations didn't go away because the architecture hasn't changed.
And part of the problem is the unreliability of those hallucinations, right?
Well, that's the downstream
At one point, they might get it right, but 10 times they might get it wrong, and you never know which
They'll probably
is
get
which.
it right more often than they get it wrong for
Sure.
most things, but you won't know which is which. So another part of the problem is what I call the looks good to me effect, which is everything they put out is grammatical, it's well-formed, it sounds plausible. And so a lot of the errors go past notice. Like the first good example of this was CNET did AI-generated news stories for a little while. And somebody went in, checked on them, and half of them, roughly speaking, had errors in them that the editors missed, right? Because the editors looked at it, it's like clean prose, okay, good. And reality is that a lot of the errors are subtle, and it just slips past. We've seen this with medical stuff time and again. The Washington Post recently did something with I think his name is Bob Wachter. I think he runs medicine for UCSF, or he's very high in the administration there. And they had him go through 10 medical answers. And he's like, they all look great, but some of them are true and really good. And, I'd have been proud to give it myself. And some of them are way off. And if you're the end user customer, you're not a doctor, you don't know which is which.
So I think anyone who's used these tools will be familiar with this problem, right? It's on the surface of them, and it's one of the core
Do you know what astonishes
limitations.
me? I'll let you finish your question in a second, but what astonishes me is I still periodically see some scientist or someone like that post, hey, I was using ChatGPT and you're not going to believe this. It made something up. I'm like, where have you been? Like,
right. I mean, this
should be pretty
core
obvious
attribute of these
This is a
systems.
core
and it has been
attribute of
since
these
the beginning.
systems.
Right. So why then has the entire AI sector, or almost all of it, gone all in on this type of AI if this kind of flaw is endemic to the very nature of the technology?
I think it's sociology, wishful thinking, and economics, and I'll try to unpack those. So sociology is a version of you give a man a hammer, they think everything is a nail. So these guys invented the hammers. They really want to believe that their hammers are going to solve every problem. So it's also a little bit about motivation. And it's also sociology, like they've really insulated themselves from criticism from people like me. They're like, well, we don't need to listen to him. And then, a couple of days ago, Ilya Sutskever reached the same conclusions that I had a long time ago. But until, Ilya said it was so, Ilya carrying a lot of weight in this community, they kind of emotionally and intellectually isolated themselves from criticism. And that's part of the cognitive psychological phenomena, of confirmation bias. You see things that support your theory, you ignore things that go against. So every time the model works, you're like, wow, and you kind of slough off.
Or it gets better, because it is getting better, right?
It gets better, but it doesn't get enough better, which is what Ilya said yesterday and what I've been saying for years.
Okay. So the pace of improvement isn't...
There's some pace of improvement. I think it's diminishing. I think a lot of people see that. And it's not just that it's diminishing, but that certain core problems like hallucinations just aren't going away. But they immunize themselves from criticism. Of course, now they're paying for it, right? Because the whole economy might fall apart. We might have an AI winter. So, you can't hide from criticism forever. They did a great job of hiding from criticism for 7 years. They raised a lot of money, and some people will get rich by selling stock early, but a lot of people are probably going to lose their shirt on it. So there was that side of it. The wishful thinking is like, I hope it works. And if you're naive as to how it works, it's easier to do that. Then you just look at a curve and you hope the curve will keep going. I call this the trillion-pound baby fallacy, after an example that I saw on Twitter, which was beautiful. A guy posted 2 pictures of his son at birth and at 3 months. He says, I have, taken the liberty of doing some extrapolation. My son, has doubled in weight in the first month. So by the time he's in college, he's going to weigh 1 trillion pounds. Now, the guy was obviously kidding, but that shows the fallacy of what I would call naive extrapolation. And that's really what's going to bite the entire field in the ass, is that there was a lot of naive extrapolation done, assuming we could just double things. There's a bunch of reasons why that's not working out. One is, the simplest one is, all those early extrapolations were done when we only used a small fraction of the internet. So you went from training a system on, I'm making up the numbers here, 1% of the internet to 2% to 4% to 8%, and you kept getting these big effects. But now everybody's using 100% of the internet, so you can't do that trick anymore. A lot of extrapolations fail because of limited resources. Like, why don't we have the entire globe covered by rabbits, right? Because they double and they double and they double. But eventually they run out of food, there's more predators, et cetera, right? So, that would be another naive extrapolation that doesn't work. And so a lot of extrapolations were like that. I promised you a third, but I forgot. Oh, sorry, the economics. So the economics is, there's a flywheel here. So, and there's an incentive here. It's really mostly about the incentive. The incentive is, if you're a venture capitalist, you have 2 ways of making money. One is, if your bets are good, you get 20% of the bets. The other is, even if your bets are bad, you get 2%. So what does that entail? It entails make really big bets, right? Because nobody can predict the future perfectly. So what do you need to make a really big bet, right? If you put in $1 million as a seed investor and you get 2% of that, that's not going to make you rich, right? But if you put in the $1 trillion and you get 2% of that, you're already rich. After a year, you take your 2% and you can go home, you can retire, you can buy a yacht.
$1 trillion investment requires the promise of something
So you
exceptional.
need a plausible story, which is the next part where I was going, is you need a plausible story for why $1 trillion might, produce a return. And these scaling laws, which yesterday or day before Sutskever acknowledged are not holding anymore, gave that plausible story, right? It was like believing that the rabbits were going to cover the earth. It seemed plausible. I have a graph here. Look at the rabbits. They're going up and up. I am sure that another month they're going to double again. And, it's going to keep doubling and then we're all going to be rich. That's basically the story that people told, which in hindsight seems like a stupid story. And I kept trying to tell people it was a stupid story, but they didn't listen. And the investors kept getting their cut.
So are we in more of an LLM bubble than an AI bubble?
Well, the problems that I've been describing are mostly with LLMs, with large language models. They don't preclude making a better AI. And Sutskever and I both think there might be ways to get there. I don't think any of them are near at hand. He said basically it's back to the drawing board. In some sense, I've been saying that too. I have some ideas about what should go on the drawing board, but nobody I think really knows how to get to AI, to artificial general intelligence. Let's say we have some forms of AI already, obviously. GPS navigation systems already work. They're great, and there's no reliability problem there, or a very tiny one. But getting to the kind of returns that people are talking about requires an architecture that is much more reliable. It can stick to known data without fabricating, et cetera, et cetera. Surely that is possible. I see no argument whatsoever that is not possible in principle. I see an argument for why that's not possible in principle with an LLM, but I don't think it's impossible. Maybe we could talk about neurosymbolic AI. Symbolic systems do stick to the data. They can make sound inferences given particular data.
So can you say more about that? Because you've been arguing for a long time that there's other paths for AI to take here. So say more about neurosymbolic AI. What exactly does that do, and how is it fundamentally different than what an LLM does?
Fundamentally, the way that the neural networks that are popular work is they do a kind of statistical estimation of distributions of data that they've seen before. They're doing pattern matching. They're kind of predicting a stable world and saying, if the world has been like this, then I can continue to expect it like this. What they are not doing is abstracting, and they're not making inferences over known facts. They just work in a completely different fashion. They do pattern matching without really reasoning. The symbolic systems, which are another tradition in AI that goes back to the beginning of AI, uses things like rules. If this thing is true, then this other thing. And uses things like tree structures, like the directory structures, the file folder structures that your computer use. They use ontologies. So a bird is a kind of animal, or a robin is a bird, and then they make inferences over those things. And they have perfectly sound techniques where they never hallucinate. Their problem is they're not good at pulling all of this stuff out of massive quantities of data. They don't scale in the sense that LLMs do. So what's brilliant about...
So you can't pump the internet into them and then they draw this model out of the entire internet.
That's right. And if they could, and some technology will be able to do that, it'll be amazing, right?
What do we use them for now? Do they have a use case on
symbolic systems or neurosymbolic systems?
Neurosymbolic systems.
Neurosymbolic systems, most of them I would say are demonstrational. There are not that many that are in widespread use. I believe that Google search itself is a neurosymbolic system. That's in pretty widespread use, right? They don't publish all the details of what they're doing, but it would appear that for the last decade, they have both used classic symbolic systems, which they've done since the company was launched, and also introduced neural networks into various pieces of it. And so I think that Google search is the world's most successful neurosymbolic system. Waymo is, as far as I can tell, neurosymbolic, and they are trying to add more neural networks inside of it, but the basic architecture is a symbolic architecture, and they are trying to find ways to put it together. Waymo is one of the most successful applications of AI. It's still a prototype. You can't use it in most of the world, but the fact that it can drive as well as it does in San Francisco is very impressive. So that's a pretty good use case that I think has gone pretty well.
Is that because it's using the data that it itself collects to build that world model, as you call it?
It's actually starting, as far as I understand it. I believe that they have pre-constructed the world model in the Waymo system. So they have structured it so that the system knows in advance of data Things like there are cars, there are roads, the roads can intersect with each other, et cetera, and a fair bit of detail. They also have a whole lot of hand-constructed data, I think, about even different cities and traffic routing and stuff like that. And all of that workflow, as far as I understand it in Waymo, is pre-built in advance. So the most successful neurosymbolic and most successful symbolic systems are pre-constructed to do different things. They also have a system called alpha geometry and another one called alpha proof that are explicitly neurosymbolic. They're pre-constructed to do particular kinds of math and so forth. And they work great in their domain. What is missing is a kind of general purpose way of doing that. The brilliant thing about ChatGPT is you can ask it anything. It doesn't have to be kind of pre-constructed. And these symbolic systems have mostly been purpose-built for particular domains. What we would really like is to be able to, on the fly, construct a hybrid neurosymbolic system for whatever you need to do, right? So let's say you want to play chess, but with a different set of rules. So you want to play chess, but the board is bigger, and we introduce a new piece that can, fly, it can teleport 7 squares each time, right? So you don't have data historically about how to play chess like that. So now you're going to have to do some reasoning, right? So how do you build a system that on the fly can deal with that? Or, maybe you want to model military conflict in the age of drones, and you don't have that much data about it. You've got, how that goes down in Ukraine right now, but you don't really know how that's going to play out in the desert. And you want to be able to simulate that and to kind of anticipate that. And you can't really get it out of the existing data. That's the problem with the neural networks, is if the existing data don't really give you the answer, then they're kind of at sea. They're lost. They don't know how to deal with regimes they haven't seen before. We still don't have an AI that can do that. When we do, and we will, it will be a game changer.
How hard it would be for some of these companies like Anthropic or OpenAI to pivot to that kind of model?
I think OpenAI is in terrible shape to do that because they're completely all in on the large language models. They have very little expertise outside of that. They're also, as Sam himself said, facing headwinds from Google, and so they're going to have some talent problems. They're really flat-footed to do that. Anthropic, I don't have enough information, but I think it's a similar situation. Google, on the other hand, is run by Demis Hassabis, who is a scientist who understands these issues, who has already made investments in neurosymbolic AI. He's clearly better positioned to make that kind of pivot than some of these other companies.
And they also have the alternative revenue model.
And they have alternative revenue, so they can make longer term plays. So, if I had to bet on one of these players, it would be DeepMind. Now, all kinds of things can happen. For example, one of these startups might more nimbly pivot to that, and then OpenAI could buy that startup. There's a lot of different scenarios, so you can't completely foretell the future. But who is better positioned right now is clearly DeepMind.
Okay, let's move to the economic argument around the bubble. Why do the financials around AI or current LLMs look so bubbly to you right now?
Because you got companies valued not just at like hundreds of times earnings, but they're not making profits at all, right? So you have an OpenAI is losing, billions of dollars a quarter, valued at $500 billion with $1.4 trillion in commitments to buy chips, with a commodity that other people basically know how to replicate. Google now does a little bit better. Google could, sell it at a loss to drive OpenAI out. Meta might have the same temptation. Meta is really threatened by OpenAI because OpenAI is going to have to pivot to surveillance, ad-driven stuff where we use your personal information. That is Meta's business. And so it would make sense for both Meta and Google to drive them out. And in fact, Meta is talking about buying Google's chips, which actually hurts NVIDIA, and maybe that hurts OpenAI. I wouldn't be surprised if Zuckerberg has chessboarded all of this out. So it's very hard for me to see OpenAI maintaining the position of dominance that people perceived it to have. I never thought it had it, but a lot of people imagined that OpenAI was the clear winner.
Isn't this the model of the internet, though, of internet companies, that you drive for user growth and worry about revenue models far later? I mean, Google and Amazon.
Yeah, sure. But if you don't have a moat, that's a problem. So, Facebook was able to do that. And their moat was what we call network effects. People had to use their stuff, right? Like I quit Facebook a long time ago. I still have an account, but I don't use it actively. But so when I was into Facebook, I had 2,000 friends there. And there was no way I could go to another place and have those 2,000 friends.
And
right?
Google had search, and Amazon had a marketplace. And so they each had something.
They had something. And Amazon had a patent on one click. And so they had a moat. It's not clear that OpenAI has any moat other than a lot of users are there. But as we have seen, their corporate customers have been migrating to Anthropic. So now all they have left is the consumers, most of whom don't want to pay for the service, right? And they're projecting they're going to have 200 million paid customers in 5 years or something like that. Most people don't like paying for stuff, Corporations are happy to pay for stuff, but they're moving to Anthropic. And you have all these people that are trying to provide the same service, many for less. You have Chinese companies doing the same. There just isn't a moat aside from, brand recognition. And in some ways, the brand is, tarnished compared to where it was a couple of years ago. People are trusting Sam Altman less. There are lawsuits about suicides. There's all kinds of stuff. And they just don't have the brand name that they had 2 years ago. And part of it was like everybody thought they were going to win. They wanted to back a winner. And they're like, wait a second. OpenAI was supposed to own this stuff. And now, Google's got the same thing.
We're also seeing a lot of talk around the circular investment that's happening in this space.
Yeah,
Can you unpack that a little bit? How does that work?
So this is a little bit out of my expertise. I know enough to know that it stinks, but I'm not, as fluent in this as other things.
Describe the smell then.
But I can describe the smell. So the smell is you have NVIDIA giving people money to buy NVIDIA chips. You have a bunch of these transactions where basically two parties are sending money back and forth. And people who monitor accounting are reminded of a bunch of past things where that didn't turn out well. And one way to think about it is if you really had all the demand that people thought, why do you have to give them money to buy your stuff? What does that tell you? And so NVIDIA put out this insane, in a way, comment the other day, which is, they said, our accounting does not resemble past things like Enron. And they did this because Michael Burry, who was famous for The Big Short, said that it did. There are some technical details here that are out of my scope. I'm not an accountant. I'm not a finance guy. But the notion that this money is kind of going back and forth, there's this crazy diagram on the internet now showing all of the reciprocal relationships between 7 different companies. And so, one part of it is the vulnerability, right? If one goes down, does that mean they all go down? And another is how do we actually think about these bookings? And some of these bookings are promised, but they're not paid for. What happens if OpenAI declines to these $1.4 trillion of promised investment? And the values of stocks are based on what we think they're going to make in the future. It doesn't matter how much money NVIDIA made in the past. It matters, they're trading whatever it is, 50 times earnings. We're anticipating such and such amount of earnings in the future. That's how the value of a company is. And if some of that is kind of, I won't say it's make-believe, but maybe dicey is a good word for it, that puts things in a different perspective.
Yeah. I mean, another aspect of this is just how transformational and not the technology, even if developed by one company, might be. And I think if we're comparing it to the dot-com bubble, the lesson from there is that most of the companies that were inflated by that bubble might have been not transformational, but the underlying technology was, and led to all sorts of other positive benefits. And I've heard people call this the rational bubble, that we're knowingly over-investing in a space under the assumption that it's going to be transformational ultimately and lead to all sorts of other potential gains.
So there's some problems with that.
Okay.
One is, although AI will be transformational, it's not clear that generative AI will ever be transformational,
right,
because
like
of the reasons that we've talked about. So, and corollary with that is we've been pouring all our money into LLMs. That's $1 trillion we could have spent on any other. I mean, we could have spent on education, which is being gutted by LLMs. If the LLMs don't solve all these problems, we have a generation of
Who's
students.
going to invent the alternatives?
Who's going to invent the alternatives? Exactly. Yeah. And that money could have gone to, let's say, 5 $200 billion grants to take other shots. I mean, think about it from a diversification of portfolio sense. We have an intellectual monoculture. We have a single investment here. It's all in, all or nothing. And I mean, Ilya was basically making this point a couple of days ago. So together, we're flat-footed. He said basically you have to go back to the drawing board. You spend $1 trillion and you have to go back to the drawing board. Like, why didn't we put more money into other drawing boards before?
Should we be worried about our pensions and our savings? And
yes,
this is a tangible concern we should all be worried about?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not a finance guy, number one. And number two, I think the most important information that I would like to know is not publicly available, which is how much the banks are caught into all of this. And secondarily, how much the pension funds into all of this. Is this, 2% of their holdings? Is it 60% of their holdings? A lot of them are heavily into NVIDIA, I think, at this point. And I'm going to guess that the average pension fund has, significant dollars in this technology. And I'm also going to guess that we're going to find out, and it's not going to be pretty.
Yeah. Just to close here, I've interviewed a lot of people who have real concerns about the effectiveness of this technology in the sense of what happens if it works.
Yeah.
Like Yoshua Bengio and Hinton we've spoken to recently. And it's all about LLMs actually being transformative and actually leading to AGI. Do you think we shouldn't be worried about those concerns? Because this isn't the technology that's going to lead to that?
I have a different take on those concerns. I just did another interview, and they told me they had just talked to Hinton, and his timeline was the same as mine, which was probably 20 years, maybe a little longer, possibly a little shorter. So, the difference between Hinton and myself is Hinton thinks that, there's fairly direct line between LLMs and getting to AGI. Whereas I think we need a whole bunch of new discoveries. But, we both think we're going to get to AGI in 20 years. And I think any reasonable person would think we don't really have a solution to what we call the alignment problem, which is how do we get the systems to obey our instructions and act in what Stuart Russell calls human compatible ways, right? We really have not made progress on that. We've been talking about it for 20 years or something like that. But we don't have good answers. And I give you some very basic cases where we fail. One is the chess stuff. Like the system reads the rules of chess and it cannot follow them. That is a failure of alignment. Like that's an easy version of alignment. It's like following known rules, right? Here's another one. Apple had in its system prompt a couple of years ago. The system prompt is a prompt that the system reads every time or at the beginning of every session. Don't hallucinate. And then the system went and hallucinated a bunch of BBC stories, so much so that they pulled it from the market. Right. So that was a failure of alignment. Here's a human compatible goal. Don't make stuff up. And I think all of them have some, version of technologies in their LLMs now to try to reduce this problem of hallucination, but none of them actually solve it. Now imagine you've got an AGI system that can do, much more sophisticated things than, current systems can do. And let's say it's aligned 96% of the time. Right? Which would be a lot better than current systems, mind you. But let's just think about that. For 4% of the time, you have a system that is, by hypothesis, smarter than any person, and that by stupidity is probably going to be hooked up to like the world's power grids and stuff like that, right? We don't have to do that. We could keep it in a sandbox, but probably we wouldn't. Let's say it messes up 4% of the time. That's a lot, and I think, again, the average person isn't accustomed to thinking about numbers like this. 96 sounds pretty good. Think about a driverless car that was correct 96% of the time. That's not actually good enough. So everybody in the industry knows that humans have about 99.99999% accuracy. With one fatal accident every 140 million miles. So like everybody our age knows somebody who's died in a car accident, but most of the time, most of the people that we know, actually live to tell the tale, right? Human drivers are actually pretty good when they're not drunk or distracted and so forth. So we're much better than 96%, right? Imagine if you had a law that said, don't shoot other people, and it was obeyed only 96% of the time. Like society would look really different, right? We need these systems to be incredibly accurate at their alignment if we're going to give them more power. And probably 20 years from now, we will. And I think it's reasonable to say, should we be building AGI if we don't have an answer to the alignment problem? And I have a friend, a colleague, who's a psychology professor. I'm fond of citing Jeffrey Miller, who made a very kind of arch statement on Twitter. He said something like, well, if we don't know how to solve the alignment problem, we should just wait on AGI, even if that means we have to wait 250 years. And like a lot of people would be like, we're not going to wait 250 years. But maybe Jeffrey Miller is right. Maybe we should. We should wait, on proceeding much further until we have a better answer. Something I keep telling people is that we should view LLMs as a dress rehearsal for AGI. Like, they're not actually AGI. It was a mistake to think that they were AGI. But we got to see, like, how would society respond if we got, a fancy AI technique? And what we discovered is society would behave in incredibly greedy, self-serving ways for the people who had the technology and screw everybody else. So we wound up, first of all, rushing this stuff to market without any real safety guarantees at all. Second of all, we've wound up in a regime where the very notion of regulation is treated as if it were insane, even though, of course, we regulate every other industry. We regulate bakeries, we regulate airplanes, we regulate cars, but somehow we're exempting AI. Like, imagine that we had AGI and we exempted it. Like, that would be the worst possible thing that we could do. Like, I don't think extinction that some of these guys worry about is all that likely, but the chance of catastrophe, basically 100%.
I think that's a great argument. And like, in that sense, would going back to the drawing board give us a better shot, like with other kinds of models?
I think
give us
it
a
might.
better shot at the alignment problem because we've kind of seen some of the real flaws of
I think it might.
An alternative.
I mean, there's no guarantees here, and we don't know how many shots at other drawing boards we need. But I don't see any principal reason why we couldn't do a lot better. And I think, going back to the drawing board will probably help.
So, if I get this right, what you're saying is we need to deflate a massive economic bubble without collapsing the economy and develop an entirely new form of AI that is in alignment with human interests.
That would be the best possible outcome.
All right, well, here's hoping for it.
Here's hoping.